I want to start by being completely honest with you. I was not ready. I know that sounds insane coming from me. Marcus Cole, the guy who spent 4 years watching every single video that Creek Stewart, Dave Canterbury, and Les Stroud ever uploaded. The guy who had Bushcraft 101 dog-eared on 17 different pages. The guy whose Steam library was 90% survival games. The Long Dark, Project Zomboid, Daisy the Forest. I had 100 hours in each of them. I had spreadsheets for my Project Zomboid runs. I cataloged the best loot routes. I theorized about base-building strategies in comment sections at 2 in the morning. I had read about water purification, fire starting, trapping, foraging, signaling, wound care, knot tying, navigation, food preservation, and yes, zombie outbreak protocols. Because that was a thing people wrote about. Seriously. There's an entire CDC preparedness document that uses zombies as a framing device. I read it twice. And I am telling you, with full sincerity, standing on the other side of it now, none of that prepared me for the smell. Nothing prepares you for the smell. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because if someone is going to find this recording, if someone is going to listen to this, and I genuinely don't know who you are or what the world looks like when you're hearing this, then I want you to understand who I was before all of this, because that matters. That context matters. My name is Marcus Cole. I'm 25 years old. At the time all of this started, I was living in my parents' house in suburban Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I had a bedroom in the basement, a 75-inch TV, a gaming PC that I'd built myself over 4 years of birthday money and part-time paychecks, and approximately 0 reasons to go outside. I wasn't depressed. I want to be clear about that. I know it sounds like a sad situation, and I know how it looks from the outside. Grown man, lives in parents' basement, plays video games all day, but I was genuinely, honestly happy. I had friends online. I had my hobbies. I had a very intentional life that I had constructed around the things I actually enjoyed. And I didn't particularly care that it didn't match what everyone else thought a 25-year-old's life was supposed to look like. What I did care about obsessively, almost embarrassingly, was survival. I don't know when it started. Probably around 15 or 16 when I stumbled onto a Bear Grylls marathon on the Discovery Channel, and my brain just lit up like a pinball machine. Something about the idea of stripping away all the complexity of modern life and reducing everything to its most essential elements, food, water, shelter, fire, just grabbed me in a way that nothing else did. The irony, of course, is that I never went and actually did any of it. I had reasons, excuses, my mom would say. I didn't have anyone to go with. The gear was expensive to start up. I had plans to save money and do a real camping trip eventually. I'd watched enough videos to know that your first attempt at something like friction fire was going to be humiliating, and the thought of doing that alone in the woods with no one to even laugh with made it seem more sad than adventurous. So I stayed home. I watched the videos, I read the books, I played the games. And then the world ended. I want to be precise about the timeline because I think it matters. The first news report started on a Tuesday. I remember because I was in the middle of a Project Zomboid run, ironic in the most universes laughing at you way imaginable, when my phone started blowing up with notifications. Mass casualty incident in Philadelphia, riots in Baltimore, some kind of coordinated attack, they were saying at first. Terrorism. Then they stopped saying terrorism and started saying unknown pathogen and aggressive behavioral symptoms, and that's when the hair on the back of my neck stood up. By Thursday, my parents were scared. My dad, Bill Cole, a retired electrician, solid guy, not the kind of man who panics about anything, came down to my basement at 6 in the morning and told me he thought we should leave. Go to my uncle's place in Ohio, just to be safe. I remember looking at him and thinking, he's right, we should go right now. And then I remember looking at the news footage playing on my second monitor, grainy cell phone video of something happening on a street in Harrisburg, people running, something moving wrong in the background, something that didn't move like a person, and I thought, Ohio isn't far enough. "Dad," I said, "I think we need to go to Grandpa's hunting cabin." He looked at me for a long moment. My grandfather, his father, had passed 3 years earlier, left the cabin to my dad in his will. It was up in Lycoming County, about 3 hours north and east of Pittsburgh, deep in the Teotihuacan State Forest. My dad had gone up there every deer season for 20 years. I'd been maybe 4 times as a kid. "That's a long drive," my dad said. "That's kind of the point," I said. We argued for an hour. My mom wanted to go to Ohio with the family. My dad was torn. I pulled up maps, showed them the density difference, tried to explain what I'd read about outbreak containment, that major population centers were going to become untenable quickly. That distance from highways and cities was the single most important variable in early survival scenarios. My dad finally said he'd drive my mom to Ohio, drop her with my uncle, and then come up to the cabin and meet me. He never made it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that part. Not right now. It's still fresh. It's only been about 6 weeks, so I'm going to tell you that I don't know what happened. I have to believe he got somewhere safe. I have to believe that because the alternative is something I can't sit with for very long without losing my ability to function, and my ability to function is currently the difference between being alive and not being alive. So I packed my car. It was a 2019 Honda Civic, not exactly the apocalypse vehicle of your dreams. I had a decent emergency kit in the trunk already, jumper cables, a small first aid kit, emergency blanket, a couple of road flares, because I'd been building one up slowly over the past couple of years. Nothing serious. Nothing that would have impressed anyone on a prepper forum. I grabbed everything I thought I'd need. Which is to say, I grabbed way too much of some things and completely forgot other things that turned out to be critically important. I took my laptop, useless within the week, approximately 40 pounds of non-perishable food, both of the firearms from my dad's gun safe, a .3006 bolt-action hunting rifle and a 12-gauge pump shotgun, along with maybe 200 rifle rounds and about 75 shotgun shells, my entire collection of survival books, a hand crank weather radio, a flashlight, extra batteries, a decent folding knife, and I'm not joking, my gaming headset. I don't know why. Habit, comfort. I grabbed it on autopilot and I didn't realize until I was already on the road. What I forgot, a water filter, a comprehensive first aid kit, most of my tools, a manual can opener, I had an electric one, extra fuel. I know. I am fully aware that every survival content creator I ever watched would be shaking their heads right now. In my defense, I had about 45 minutes to pack the entire kit of my post-apocalyptic survival setup while also being terrified out of my mind. And the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application in a high-stress situation is, I cannot stress this enough, enormous. I got on the road at about 2 in the afternoon on that Thursday. The highways were bad but not impossible yet. I saw 3 accidents that might not have been accidents. I saw a National Guard convoy moving south on I-80 that did not look like they had any idea where they were going. I saw a gas station on fire. I kept driving. I got to the cabin at dusk. Grandpa's hunting cabin. I hadn't been there in over a decade, and standing in front of it in the gathering dark with the sound of the forest all around me and the distant glow of what might have been a fire somewhere south. Standing there, I felt something I didn't expect to feel. Safe. Not safe. Not safe the way I felt in my basement with my headphones on and a bag of chips in my lap, but something more fundamental than that. Something ancient. The forest was quiet. The air was cold and smelled like pine and dead leaves and nothing else. No sirens, no screaming, No sound of the thing I'd heard on that phone video, that low, directionless moan that had been following me out of every news broadcast for the past 2 days. Just wind, just trees, just a small wooden structure that had kept my grandfather warm for 50 years of hunting seasons. I sat in my car for about 5 minutes and cried. I'm not ashamed of that. It needed to happen and then it was done. Then I got out, found the key under the third porch step where my dad always hid it, and went inside. The cabin was about 400 square feet. One main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area with a propane camp stove and a hand pump for the well, 2 sets of bunk beds in an alcove, and a loft overhead with storage. The loft had 4 plastic totes full of hunting gear, orange vests, old boots, rope, various tools, and about 200 pounds of supplies my grandfather had left there over the years. I found a hand crank and opener up there. I almost laughed, almost. There was a small generator in a shed out back, a half-cord of firewood stacked against the side of the cabin, and a well that my grandfather had been using for 30 years. No water filter. But the well was deep and the water came up cold and clear, and I'd read enough to know that deep rural wells are generally safe, especially with no industry nearby. That first night, I built a fire in the wood stove. It took me 3 tries because I was using too large of wood too fast. A rookie mistake I was immediately embarrassed about despite there being no one around to witness it. Heated up a can of soup and sat in the dark listening to the hand crank radio. The broadcasts were getting worse. Major cities were described as experiencing significant civil unrest. That was the phrase they kept using. Significant civil unrest, as if what I'd seen on those videos was just a protest that got out of hand. I turned the radio off and sat in the dark for a while. Then I got out my notebook, a physical paper notebook, spiral-bound, because I'd read enough about grid-down scenarios to know that paper is forever, and I started making lists. What I had, what I needed, what my priorities were. Priority 1, security assessment of the cabin. Priority 2, water security, how long could the well sustain me? Priority 3, food inventory and ration planning. Priority 4, town run for critical supplies. Priority 5, long-term fortification and sustainability. I had read about this. I had watched dozens of videos about post-SHTF base establishment. I knew the frameworks. I knew the terms. I knew that in Project Zomboid, your first move was always to find a vehicle, check the surrounding area for threats, and then start methodically clearing and fortifying. This was not Project Zomboid, but it was in some ways startlingly similar. I fell asleep in the chair by the wood stove with my notebook on my lap, both guns within arm's reach, and slept the most exhausted, dreamless sleep of my entire life. The next morning, I did my security assessment. The cabin sat in a small clearing, maybe an acre, surrounded by dense mixed forest, mostly oak and maple, some pine. The driveway was a quarter-mile dirt track that connected to a gravel county road, which connected to a state route about 2 miles west. There was a creek about 300 yards north of the cabin that I could hear if I stood still, and the wind was right. The cabin itself had 3 windows, one in the front facing the porch, one on the eastern wall, and a small one over the kitchen sink, and 2 doors, a main door in front and a back door that opened toward the generator shed. The windows were single-pane glass with no shutters. The doors were solid wood but had flimsy locks that any motivated person could kick through without much effort. I noted all of this in my book. Window coverage inadequate, door security inadequate, perimeter visibility limited by tree line, 40 to 50-foot blind zone on all sides. I knew what I needed. I'd read about it extensively. Heavy-gauge hardware cloth or plywood for window shutters, crossbars for the doors. Ideally, some kind of noise-making perimeter alarm, fishing line with cans, something simple. I'd need to clear some brush from the tree line to improve sight lines. I had none of the materials to do any of that. But I had the rifle, I had the shotgun, and I had the knowledge that I was 3 hours from the nearest major city, on a road that almost nobody knew existed. The probability of a threat finding me in the first few days was low. Low but not zero. I spent the morning doing two things: inventorying what I had and walking the perimeter. The perimeter walk was the first time I actually felt like I was doing something real, something that connected to all those hours of watching and reading. I walked slow, scanning the tree line, looking for signs of disturbance. I was watching for broken branches, disturbed leaf litter, any sign that something larger than a deer had moved through recently. I found deer tracks. I found what I was fairly sure was a fox burrow along the northern edge. I found a section of old barbed wire fence, buried under years of leaf fall, that marked what had probably been the edge of a field before the forest reclaimed it. I found no signs of people, no signs of anything that should worry me. I stood at the edge of my small clearing and looked out into those dark Pennsylvania woods and felt something I can only describe as profoundly, almost religiously present. No phone, no internet, no dual monitors, just the trees and the cold November air and my own breathing. It was almost peaceful. And then I went back inside and did math. Math was less peaceful. I had enough food to last roughly 3 weeks if I rationed carefully. I had 2 cases of water bottles I'd thrown in the car at the last minute, plus the well. I had a small bottle of bleach in the cleaning supplies under the kitchen sink, which I could use to treat water if the well became suspect. I had the firewood for heat, and there was obviously more in the forest. I had light from the flashlight and a box of emergency candles I'd found in the loft. What I didn't have: a way to hunt effectively. The rifle was a hunting rifle, my grandfather's, and I'd fired it maybe a dozen times in my life. I wasn't what anyone would call a marksman. I could probably take a deer if it was standing still at reasonable range, but I hadn't fired a weapon in 4 years, and I knew my skills there were more theoretical than practical. I didn't have fishing gear, though the creek to the north was almost certainly stocked. I didn't have trapping supplies, though I'd read extensively about snares and had the barbed wire that could theoretically be fashioned into something useful. I didn't have antibiotics or any serious medical supplies. I didn't have a good blade. The folding knife I'd grabbed was fine, but a good fixed blade would be better for processing game. I didn't have a water filter, and I was going to become increasingly paranoid about the well water over time regardless of how clear it looked. The conclusion was unavoidable. I needed to go into town. I spent 2 more days preparing, not because I needed 2 days, but because I needed those 2 days to convince myself to leave the cabin. Once I left the safety of those trees, I would be exposed. I would be on roads. I would be near people, or near whatever people had become. I had no idea what the situation looked like in a small Pennsylvania town 3 hours from the nearest major city. I told myself I was doing valuable prep work. I practiced building fires until I could reliably have one going in under 5 minutes. I did walk after walk of the perimeter, getting it memorized. I cut and split additional firewood from a fallen oak near the edge of the clearing, my arms absolutely hatting me by the end, because I had the upper body strength of someone who had spent the last several years sitting in a computer chair, which is exactly what I was. I rationed my food strictly. I practiced loading and unloading the rifle and shotgun until it felt automatic. I wrote out a detailed list of everything I needed to find in town, prioritized by criticality. And on the morning of day 4, I got in my Civic and drove toward civilization. The town was called Millhaven, population 2,200 on a good day. It was about 12 miles from the cabin, straddling a small river, with a main street that had a hardware store, a grocery, a pharmacy, a diner, and maybe 15 other businesses of varying utility. I knew it slightly from those childhood trips. The kind of small Pennsylvania town that feels like it exists slightly outside of time, where the diner still has pie under glass domes on the counter, and everyone knows everyone else's business. I came in from the north, slow, windows down despite the cold, listening, watching. The town looked abandoned. That was my first impression. Cars sitting at weird angles on the main road. A garbage can tipped over in front of the diner. The traffic light at the main intersection blinking yellow on one side and dark on the other, which meant power had been intermittent at some point. But there were no bodies. No obvious damage. No signs of whatever I'd seen on those phone videos. I parked a block from the hardware store, grabbed the shotgun. I didn't want to walk around with the rifle, too conspicuous, and got out. The silence was oppressive, not the good silence of the forest, a wrong silence, a silence that had replaced something. I walked to the hardware store and tried the door. Locked. I stood there for a moment. In Project Zomboid, you just smash the window. In real life, you feel deeply weird about smashing a window, even now, even with everything. I walked around the side and found the loading door in the alley. It was a metal door with a padlock, but the hasp was old and the screws holding it to the frame were corroded. I found a length of rebar leaning against the dumpster and used it as a pry bar. It took about 6 minutes and more effort than I expected, and the noise it made when the hasp finally tore free was loud enough that I immediately pressed myself against the wall and stood there, heart hammering, watching both ends of the alley for a solid 2 minutes. Nothing came. I went inside. The inside of Millhaven Hardware smelled like oil and sawdust and old lumber, the good honest smell of a proper small-town hardware store that has been selling the same stuff to the same families for decades. I stood just inside the door and let my eyes adjust and tried to get my breathing under control. I had my list. I started working through it. Plywood back corner lumber section. I found 1/4-inch and 1/2-inch sheets. I took 4 1/2-inch sheets and managed to get them outside through the loading door, cursing the fact that they barely fit in a Civic and that I was alone, and plywood sheets are genuinely awkward to maneuver solo. Hardware screws, hinges, barrel bolts for the doors, wire, rope, chain. Tools, I found a quality hatchet, a good fixed-blade knife still in its packaging, a hand saw, a hammer, and a pry bar to replace the rebar. I found a headlamp, which was better than my flashlight for working with both hands. I found a hand-cranked drill, which felt almost absurdly old-fashioned until I realized that not needing power was actually the whole point now. I found 2 large steel crossbars that could be modified to work as door barricade brackets. I found a bag of zip ties which I'd read were endlessly useful. I grabbed 2 bags. I found a section of galvanized wire that I was going to use for perimeter noise alarms. Thin enough to be nearly invisible across a path, strong enough to rattle a tin can loudly. Then I went to the pharmacy. The pharmacy door was unlocked. Someone had been here before me. The prescription medication cases in the back were smashed open and mostly cleaned out. The over-the-counter section was mostly intact. I found ibuprofen, acetaminophen, antibiotic ointment, bandages in multiple sizes, gauze, medical tape, Sam splints, eye wash, hydrogen peroxide, 2 ace bandages, and a bottle of iodine tablets. The iodine tablets were the most important thing I found that day, possibly of the entire first month. They'd sat on the bottom shelf in a dusty box that the person who'd looted the prescription drugs hadn't bothered with. Iodine tablets, water purification, problem solved in a little orange box. I also found, and I took this as a genuine sign from the universe, a full first aid guidebook on the health and wellness shelf, the kind that your doctor's office waiting room would have. I grabbed it immediately. The grocery store had been hit harder. Most of the perishables were obviously done. The power had been out long enough that the smell hit me from the parking lot, but the canned goods section was largely intact, which surprised me. I'd expected more panic buying, more stripping of shelves, but I think in a town this small, most people had evacuated, packed up their families and driven toward some imagined safety somewhere else, leaving the shelves full of canned corn and black beans and tomato soup. I felt something complicated about that. Those people thought they were making the smart choice. I loaded canned goods into the plastic bins I'd grabbed from the hardware store. I took variety: vegetables, legumes, fish, soup bases. I took rice and pasta and flour and sugar and salt, which I'd read were the four foundations of long-term food storage and which I now believed completely. I found a metal hand grinder bolted to a shelf in the baking section that I pried free. It could grind grain, which meant I could theoretically use whole wheat berries if I found them, extending my flour situation considerably. I found a shelf of protein powder that I hadn't thought about but immediately recognized as useful, compact, calorie-dense, would store well. I found a battery section that still had most of its stock. I cleaned it out, every size. I found candles, matches, lighters. I took all of it. I found fishing line and hooks in a small sporting goods section at the back. I took every spool of line and every packet of hooks. I found 2 decent folding pocket knives still on a display rack. I took those too. I was loading my 4th run of supplies into the car when I heard it. It started as a sound I couldn't place, somewhere between a groan and a scrape, rhythmic and wrong. I froze. The hair on my arms went up. And then a man came around the corner of the grocery store. I need to be careful about how I describe what I saw, because I don't want to sensationalize it and I don't want to be gratuitous. I'm going to try to be precise and honest. He had been a man, you could still tell that. Middle-aged, heavyset, wearing a flannel shirt and work boots. But the way he moved was wrong in a way that's almost impossible to fully describe. There was no intention in it, no destination. He was moving the way water moves, following the path of least resistance, and his face had a kind of terrible blankness, eyes open but seeing nothing, or seeing everything the same way. He hadn't seen me yet. Everything I'd ever read about this exact scenario ran through my head simultaneously and produced a kind of paralysis. Distance, 30 feet. Wind coming from behind me toward him. Cover car was between us. Options: make noise, draw him in another direction, retreat back into the store, confront, run. I did what I now recognize as the correct thing, but I did it for mostly the wrong reasons. I stood perfectly still. He turned slowly, moving away from me, went around the far corner of the building and was gone. I stood there for probably 90 seconds, not moving, not breathing more than necessary. Then I finished loading the car, got in and drove back to the cabin. I did not stop. I did not go back for additional runs. I had been in town for just under 3 hours and I had what I had and it was going to have to be enough. I was halfway back to the cabin when I started shaking. My hands on the wheel, just shaking. I had to pull over for a few minutes. I want to be honest about something. Every survival scenario I had ever played, every video I'd ever watched, every forum post I'd ever read, none of it had prepared me for the specific emotional texture of seeing a person who was no longer a person. Not because the concept was unfamiliar. The concept was very familiar. I had played games with this exact premise hundreds of times. But there's something your nervous system does when it encounters the real thing that no amount of theoretical preparation accounts for. It's like the difference between reading about a car accident and being in one. The intellectual understanding that such things exist doesn't buffer the visceral reality of their existence. I sat by the side of the road and shook for about 5 minutes. Then I drove the rest of the way to the cabin. The next 10 days were the most physically demanding of my life. I slept well, which surprised me. My body was so thoroughly exhausted by the end of each day that consciousness simply shut off the moment I lay down, and I woke up with the gray light of November mornings feeling genuinely rested in a way I hadn't experienced since I was a kid. All those years of staying up until 3 in the morning watching videos, and then sleeping until noon had given me a terrible relationship with sleep. Manual labor and fresh air fixed it within a week. I started with the door barricades. The crossbars I'd taken from the hardware store needed to be mounted. I had to drill pilot holes, which with a hand crank drill was slow and tedious but doable. I mounted steel brackets on both sides of both doors and cut 2 lengths of lumber to drop into them as crossbars. When seated, they could resist a significant amount of force. I tested them both, trying to push in from outside, and felt satisfied. The door locks were almost irrelevant now. The bars were the security. The windows were next. I cut the plywood into panels sized to cover each window. Added hinges so they could fold open from the top. I wanted to be able to open them for ventilation and light if I felt safe, while being able to drop them and bolt them closed in under 5 seconds. I added small sliding bolts to lock each shutter from the inside. It took 3 days to get all 3 windows done to my satisfaction. The perimeter alarm was simpler. I ran the galvanized wire about 50 feet out from the cabin in a rough circle, tied at ankle height between trees, with a series of tin cans threaded on each segment. Anyone or anything moving through the forest toward the cabin in the dark would hit the wire and make noise. I tested it myself, walked the perimeter from outside at night, hit the wire 3 different times, and each time the cans rattled loudly enough that I was sure I would have heard it from inside. It wasn't perfect. It was a one-time use alarm. Once someone tripped it, they'd know it was there. But it would give me time to wake up, grab a weapon, and figure out what I was dealing with. I cleared brush from the tree line. I widened my sight lines by about 15 feet on the north and east, which were the approaches I was most worried about. South was the driveway, and I could watch that from the porch. West was a steep, rocky slope that would be difficult for anything to come down quietly. I collected rainwater in the plastic bins from the hardware store, set them under the eaves where the roof channeled water, covered them with screens of hardware cloth I'd found in the loft to keep debris and insects out. The well remained my primary water source, but I started treating everything with iodine tablets as a precaution. They made the water taste slightly medicinal, which I got used to. I started a fire-a-day practice. Every morning before anything else, I started the wood stove using a different method than the day before. Matches one day, lighter the next, then a ferro rod I'd found in the hunting gear in the loft. I made myself use less tinder each time, forced myself to get the fire going with what I had. By the end of the first week, I could have a solid fire going in under 3 minutes with damp wood and a spark. It sounds small. It wasn't small. I felt something every time that fire caught, something that I think is close to what my grandfather probably felt every November up here, that old human satisfaction of having solved the most ancient problem. I tried to set snares. This is where the gap between theory and practice was most brutal. I had read about rabbit snares extensively. I knew the principle's small noose set at the right height across a well-used run, attached to a trigger mechanism, or simply fixed to a branch. I'd watched the videos. Dave Canterbury explaining the process, calm and methodical, snare going up in under 2 minutes. I spent an hour making my first snare. Finding a rabbit run was actually the easy part. I knew what to look for, and the forest floor near the creek showed clear sign, the slightly compressed paths where rabbits habitually traveled. I set the snare. I waited. I checked it the next morning, empty. I reset it, empty again. I tried 3 different locations. I tried different heights. I tried different trigger mechanisms. I was out there for 6 straight mornings checking snares and catching exactly nothing, and my confidence was beginning to crumble in a fairly fundamental way. On the 7th morning, I caught a rabbit. I found it in the snare, alive, struggling, and stood there for a moment with something cold washing through me. Because I knew what came next, and I had thought about it in the abstract many times, and thinking about it in the abstract and then standing in front of a living animal looking at you are, once again, very different things. I did what needed to be done. I was not good at it. I was slow and clumsy, and I apologized out loud to the rabbit, which I am aware is not a particularly stoic survivalist thing to do. But I did it. And I processed the animal back at the cabin. I'd read the instructions so many times I almost could have done it with my eyes closed. Almost. Reality has a texture that instructions don't quite capture, the warmth of it, the smell, the immediate and visceral understanding that this is where food actually comes from, beneath all the cellophane and refrigeration. I made a stew. I had dried onion and garlic powder from the grocery run. I had a can of tomatoes. I had the rabbit, which I had broken down into pieces and added with some water and salt. I let it simmer on the propane camp stove for 2 hours. It was the best thing I had ever eaten. That is not hyperbole. I don't know if it was the hunger, or the cold, or the fact that I had, for the first time in my entire life, genuinely made something from nothing, built a meal from the raw materials of the forest in my own imperfect hands. I sat by the wood stove and ate that stew and cried again. Different tears this time. I need to talk about loneliness. It's one of those things that doesn't come up much in survival content. The videos are always focused on the physical skills: fire, water, shelter, food. The emotional dimension of actually being alone in the woods for weeks on end is not really a topic that generates a lot of views. It was harder than anything else. I kept the radio on for as long as the batteries lasted, then started hand cranking it for 30-minute windows twice a day to conserve the mechanism. The broadcasts became less frequent, less organized. Within the first 2 weeks, I'd lost several of the stations I'd been following. What remained was a patchwork of emergency broadcasts, some clearly pre-recorded, some what sounded like individual operators, amateur radio people, ham radio operators, doing what they could from wherever they were. I wrote in my notebook, a lot. I documented everything: the snare placements, the fire starting times, the water consumption, the food inventory, the perimeter checks, but I also just wrote thoughts, memories, conversations with my parents that I had in my head and that I wrote down as if they were real. I wrote to my dad. I told him what I'd figured out about the snares. I told him about the stew. I told him I was sorry we hadn't talked more when we had the chance. I talked out loud sometimes, to the cabin, to the trees, to myself when I was doing tasks, narrating what I was doing the way I'd heard instructors narrate in the videos. Now I'm going to square the notch a little more. Now I'm going to check the tension on the wire. It kept me tethered. I thought about my online friends. I thought about the people I'd known purely through screens for years, better than I'd known most people in physical proximity to me. I wondered where they were. I wondered if they'd had any of the same instincts I did, or if they'd stayed in cities, or if they'd ended up somewhere safer somehow. I thought about all the hours I'd spent in virtual survival scenarios, the hundreds of hours of game time, the thousands of hours of videos and reading, and I thought about what a strange and particular preparation that had been. Incomplete, imperfect, riddled with gaps that were revealing themselves every single day. But not nothing at all. I knew why I was sleeping with my head toward the door. I knew why I was building the fire at dawn rather than at dusk. I knew the difference between the way deer moved through the forest and the wrong, rhythmic movement of something else. I knew to save every container, every piece of wire, every rubber band. I knew that the thing most likely to kill me wasn't anything dramatic. It was getting sloppy about water treatment, or failing to maintain my firewood supply before a cold snap, or putting off a necessary repair because I was tired and comfortable. Theory, imperfectly applied, is still better than nothing. I told myself that regularly. On day 16, I went back to Millhaven. I wasn't out of food. I had enough for another week if I was careful, and the snares were producing reasonably well. About 3 or 4 small animals a week now that I'd improved my technique. But I had 2 things on the list that I'd decided were non-negotiable: a water filter and more ammunition. The water filter was safety. The ammunition was also safety. I drove in from the north again, came in even slower this time, stopped the car almost a mile out and walked the rest of the way in. I'd left my car on a side road where it couldn't be seen from the main street. The town looked different than it had 2 weeks ago. There were more cars. Different cars, some of them positioned in ways that suggested they'd been arranged, not abandoned. And there was smoke from one of the buildings on the south end of Main Street, not a fire smoke, a cooking smoke, a controlled burn. People were here. I stood in the shadow of a building for a long time, watching, counting windows, counting the positions of vehicles, looking for movement. I saw two people on the roof of the diner. They were watching the road to the south. Neither of them was looking my way. There was a group there, survivors who decided to stay and make a go of it in the town itself. On one hand, that was interesting and not necessarily threatening. On the other hand, I had no way of knowing who these people were or how they were organized or how they felt about someone coming into their space and taking supplies. I sat with that decision for a while. Everything I'd read about post-collapse group dynamics was that stranger encounters needed to be approached carefully. Not paranoidly. Not every stranger was a threat, but with clear awareness that the social contract that governed normal life had been significantly disrupted, and that people under extreme stress sometimes made choices they wouldn't otherwise make. I decided not to approach them, not yet. Instead, I circled around the back of the main street, moving through yards and alleyways, staying away from the diner and the rooftop watchman. The sporting goods section of the grocery store hadn't given me everything I needed. There was a gun shop on the north end of Main Street, away from where the survivors seemed to be concentrated, that I'd noticed on my first run. The gun shop had been broken into. The main display cases were smashed, the obvious stuff gone: handguns, tactical rifles, whatever had been on prominent display. But the back stockroom, which I got to by going through a busted door frame, still had ammunition. Cases of it, 12-gauge shells, .22 LR .308, and in the corner, still on its hook, a mid-range water filter that the previous occupant had apparently purchased and then never picked up, still in its sealed box. The water filter changed my life. Seriously. The iodine tablets were fine, but the filter let me process large quantities of water from any source: the creek, the rainwater collection bins, anything, quickly and without the chemical taste. It sounds mundane. It was the opposite of mundane. I loaded what I could carry and made my way back to the car. And then on my way out at the north edge of town, I heard a voice. Hey, you stop. I stopped. I had the shotgun. My hand didn't go to it. I'd thought about this scenario enough to know that reaching for a weapon when someone addresses you is the fastest way to escalate a situation that might not need escalating. I turned slowly with my hands visible. There were two of them. A woman who looked to be in her 40s, dark hair going gray, wearing a canvas jacket and carrying what I recognized as a Mossberg 500, same model as mine. And a teenager, maybe 16 or 17, behind her, holding a hunting rifle in a way that suggested he knew how to use it but was hoping he wouldn't have to. Where'd you come from? The woman said. North, I said. I've got a place in the forest. I'm not looking for trouble. What were you looking for? Supplies, ammo, water filter, same things as everyone else. She looked at me for a moment with dark, measuring eyes. You take anything from the diner, from the supply we've been building. No, ma'am. I've been in the gun shop on your north end. Didn't touch anything south of the hardware store. Another long pause. The teenager was trying to look less nervous and not quite pulling it off. There's a group of us, the woman said finally. 12 people. We've been here almost 2 weeks. I know. I saw the smoke. You were watching us. Briefly, decided it was better to observe than approach until I knew more. She almost smiled at that. Almost. That's a careful way of thinking. I've had some time to think. Her name was Patricia. She'd been the town's pharmacist before all of this, which explained the organized, systematic way she'd been approaching the survival situation. The teenager was her nephew, Kevin. The group of 12 had been slowly fortifying the diner and the two buildings adjacent to it, rotating watch shifts, pooling supplies. She told me about what they'd seen to the south. More of them moving along the highway. Not in huge numbers, not the overwhelming hordes of movie logic, but steadily, spread out, following roads and paths the way something with only the most basic instincts would follow roads and paths. The valley to the south was concerning. The town's position on the river was both an asset and a liability. I told her about the cabin, the snares, the perimeter setup. "You did all of that alone," Kevin said, speaking for the first time. There was something in his voice, not quite disbelief, but genuine surprise. "I had some prior knowledge," I said, which was both true and slightly absurd. Patricia and I talked for over an hour, standing in the cold at the north edge of town. She was direct, practical, and clearly very intelligent. She asked good questions and listened to the answers. She told me they'd lost 2 people in the first week, a married couple who tried to make a run south to find family. By the end of the conversation, we had an informal understanding. I would continue to operate from the cabin. They would continue to hold the town. We would share information. I'd come by every 4 or 5 days with whatever I'd learned from the radio and the forest, and they'd share what they were seeing from the southern approaches. It wasn't an alliance. It wasn't a formal agreement. It was 2 people who both understood the value of good information deciding to exchange it. "One more thing," Patricia said as I was leaving. She went back inside for a moment and came out with 2 boxes, antibiotics, actual prescription antibiotics, amoxicillin, 2 full courses worth. I looked at her. "I'm a pharmacist," she said. "I know what the stockpile is. You're alone in the woods. You can't afford to get sick without treatment." I took the boxes, "Thank you." "Don't be a stranger," she said, and went back inside. The last stretch of that first month was, by any measure, the hardest. The temperature dropped. Not catastrophically. This was Pennsylvania in November, not Montana in January, but into the low 20s at night, with a wet cold that soaked into everything. The firewood consumption increased dramatically. I did the math and realized I needed to significantly expand my woodpile before the deep winter set in. The cutting and splitting of firewood is one of those tasks that survival content makes look almost meditative. A man with an axe, a neat stack growing, the satisfying crack of a round splitting clean. And there is a version of it that is like that. But that version happens after you've developed the muscles and the technique and the instinct for where the grain runs and where the fault lines are in a piece of wood. In the beginning, it just hurts. Everything hurts. My hands blistered, the blisters popped and calloused over, and the calluses thickened into something that no longer split when I worked. My shoulders and back found muscles they hadn't previously acknowledged existed. I slept 12 hours some nights and still felt like I'd been hit by a truck. But I built the woodpile. Every day, regardless of how I felt, I cut for at least 2 hours. By the end of the month, I had what I estimated to be a cord and a half stacked against the south wall of the cabin, and I felt, for the first time in my adult life, genuinely, physically capable. I tried to make friction fire. Finally, I'd been putting it off, embarrassed by the prospect of failure, which is silly in retrospect because there was no one to fail in front of. I carved a spindle from a dry willow branch, carved a hearthboard from the same, found dry grass and bark shavings for the tinder bundle. I watched the video in my head. I'd seen it so many times I could almost hear the narration. And I failed. The first day, I failed for an hour straight, producing nothing but smoke and a burning forearm. The second day, I failed more efficiently. Getting closer. Starting to feel where the technique was breaking down, the pressure was inconsistent. I was losing speed at the end of each downstroke. The third day, I made coal. I made coal from nothing but 2 pieces of dry wood in my own hands, and I blew that coal into flame in a tinder bundle of dry grass and cedar bark shavings. And I held that small, improbable fire in my cupped palms, and felt something so enormous and complete that I had to sit down. This is the thing I want to try to explain, because I think it's the thing that can't quite be captured in a video or a book or a game. The doing of a thing changes you in a way that the knowing about it doesn't. I had known about friction fire for 9 years. I knew every step of the process. I could have written a detailed article about it, explained the physics, listed the best wood combinations, described the common failure points. And knowing all of that had not produced a single coal. The doing produced the coal. The failure and the repetition and the physical memory building in my hands and shoulders, that was what produced the coal. I think about that a lot now. Not with regret. I can't live in regret about the years I spent learning from screens when I could have been learning from dirt. Those years gave me the framework. They gave me the vocabulary and the theory and the genuine passion for this stuff that drove me to keep trying when the snares failed and the fires wouldn't catch. Without that foundation, I would have been lost in a much more complete way. But the doing is different. The doing is irreplaceable, and I wish someone had told me that more clearly earlier. Not because I would have necessarily listened. I was pretty comfortable in my basement, but because the truth of it is significant enough that it deserves to be said plainly. Knowledge is a map. The territory is always different than the map, but maps are still worth having. On day 29, I heard something on the radio that I'd been half expecting and half dreading since the beginning. A broadcast, military, organized, clearly from a government source, announcing the establishment of a secure resupply station on the highway approximately 22 miles to my south. Food, medicine, fuel, people were being asked to make their way there. I sat with that for a long time. The smart play, arguably, was to go. Organized government resources, established security, other people. The things that a cabin-alone situation in the woods was always eventually going to struggle to provide. But I thought about the broadcasts from the first days, the ones that had told people to shelter in place and then to evacuate, the ones that had described situations as manageable when it was very clear they weren't, the ones that had been transmitting right up until they simply stopped. I thought about the people who had driven south toward what they'd been told was safety. I wasn't ready to trust a broadcast, not yet. I wrote down the location and frequency. I filed it away. I told Patricia about it the next time I saw her. She felt the same way I did. "We stay," she said. "At least for now, we watch and wait." Watching and waiting was something I was getting good at. It's been 6 weeks. I'm going to try to tell you who I am now as opposed to who I was, because I think that's what this recording is really about. Not just the survival logistics, though those are real and may be useful to someone, but the inner dimension of it. The way a person changes when circumstances strip everything down to the most essential version of themselves. I am stronger than I was. Physically, obviously, my body has been doing things for 6 weeks that it had never done before, and it has adapted accordingly. But I also mean something less tangible. I have a tolerance for discomfort now that I didn't have before. Cold is just cold. Physical tiredness is just tiredness. These things are real, but they're not catastrophic. My baseline for what constitutes an emergency has shifted considerably, and most of what used to feel like a problem no longer registers. I am more patient. This one surprised me most because patience was never a strength. I spent years in front of screens where every moment of non-entertainment could be resolved by clicking something else. The forest moves at a different speed. You cannot click your way to a rabbit in a snare. You cannot load a faster server when you're waiting for a fire to catch. You set things up and you wait and you accept the pace of the world around you. And after a while, you stop feeling the friction of that acceptance because patience is also, it turns out, a skill. I am lonelier than I've ever been and more comfortable being alone than I've ever been. And I'm not sure those two things are contradictory. I miss people. I miss my dad. I miss the particular companionship of being in the same room as someone, not even talking, just the ambient human presence of another person. I miss my online friends in a specific, aching way that surprises me. They were real relationships, whatever anyone might have said about them. At the same time, I have found a kind of interior life in the solitude that I didn't know was available to me. Without the constant input of screens and feeds and content, my own thoughts have gotten louder and more substantial. I think more clearly. I dream vividly, remember the dreams, spend time actually considering what they might mean. I have conversations with myself that are, I think, more honest than most of the conversations I had with other people before all of this. I know that sounds like rationalizing, maybe it is, but it also just feels true. The gap between what I knew and what I could do has narrowed. Not closed. I still make mistakes every day, still run into situations where my theoretical knowledge runs out, and I have to improvise with incomplete information, and accept that the outcome might not be what I'd hope. But I can make fire. I can find food. I can keep myself warm and safe and relatively healthy. I can look at a piece of ground and tell you whether a rabbit has been there recently. I can hear a sound in the forest and know, with reasonable confidence, whether it belongs there or not. Those things are mine now, not learned from a video or a book or a game. Mine, earned. I want to say something directly if you're listening to this. If you're someone who's in a similar situation, or who's thinking about being in a similar situation, or who's just watching this because survival content is interesting and you're curious about what it's like. Don't wait. That's the thing. That's the simple, stupid thing I wish someone had forced me to sit with. Don't wait until you have the perfect gear or the perfect partner or the perfect location or the perfect amount of time. Don't wait until you feel ready, because ready is a feeling that mostly comes from having already done the thing. Go outside, make a fire badly, set a snare wrong, build a shelter that leaks. Get cold and wet and frustrated and do it again. Every skill I have right now I built starting from nothing under pressure without a tutorial I could pause. And I made it. Not cleanly, not impressively, but I made it. The knowledge was the foundation. The YouTube videos and the books and yes, honestly, even the games, they gave me a framework, a vocabulary, a genuine love for this stuff that didn't disappear when things got hard. I am not dismissing any of that. I am saying that it needed the dirt and the cold and the failures to become real. Go outside, do it wrong, do it again. I'm going to continue recording these. I don't know if anyone will ever hear them. I'm speaking into a handheld recorder that I found in the cabin's loft, left there by my grandfather who used to narrate his hunts. It feels right, somehow, to use his voice machine to tell this story. I'm planning a third town run in 4 days. Patricia has indicated they may need help with a drainage issue on the south side of their fortifications, standing water that's going to become a serious sanitation problem. I know enough about basic engineering from various rabbit holes I've been down to have some ideas. It'll be good to have a concrete problem to solve. The snares are producing well. I'm getting better. The woodpile is substantial. The cabin is solid and warm, and as my grandfather would have said, tight, no drafts, no leaks, no gaps that the cold can find. The forest is quiet tonight. The perimeter alarm hasn't triggered in a week. The stars, on nights when the clouds clear, are more stars than I've ever seen from a suburban backyard, unobscured by light pollution. The Milky Way, a literal river of light that I stand in my clearing and just look at for longer than is probably practical. My grandfather built something here. He came up here every year and touched something old and real and necessary, and then he came home and lived his life. And I think I understand that better now than I ever could have from the basement. I am 25 years old, and I am learning to live. If you're finding this, if you're listening, then you're learning too. We all are. That's okay. That's how it works.